Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. So, speaker for today's talk is Dr. Preeti Mudliar, and she is going to speak with us on a very interesting topic of gender access to technology. And Preeti is currently working as an assistant professor at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, IITB, and she has a PhD from University of Texas Austin in Communication Studies. She has also worked as a journalist with the Indian Express in Pune before her PhD, and after her PhD, she has worked with Xerox Research Center in Bangalore. Preeti has traveled because of her work in different states of India, and she has a lot of interesting stories to tell about her research. But today we will listen to a story on gender practices around Wi-Fi infrastructure. Over to you, Preeti.
Okay, thank you so much, Rashmi, for extending this invitation at ATREE. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to be presenting my work to all of you. So the study that I'm going to be presenting on reports on how spaces that host Wi-Fi infrastructures that are ostensibly public may not really be public, but are in fact highly gendered. So what this means for a public Wi-Fi access and use is that while men are free to occupy these spaces and thus freely access and use the internet, because of social norms, the women are often confined to their homes and thus very dependent on the patchy and often spotty mobile internet signals that they receive. And this has very interesting implications for how they use the internet, what they use the internet for. So that is what I'm going to be talking on. But to begin with, I want to start off by saying that I really did not set out to study Wi-Fi. What I was studying was the National Optic Fiber Network, or BharatNet, whose agenda is to really connect rural India and onboard them onto the internet. So this was the UPA government's policy initiative in 2011, and it involved laying incremental optical fiber right up from the block to the Gram Panchayat level. To provide the villages high-speed broadband. And the aim was to connect all 250,000 Gram Panchayats in India. But if you've been following reports on the project, you'd know that this particular NOFN project has missed its deadline countless times. And as of yesterday, on the BBNL website, the number of Gram Panchayats that were connected till date is just 1,20,130. So the question that I began my work was, what happens after the NOFN comes to a village? So this is the essential question that I wanted to explore. What happens when the infrastructure comes to a village? What happens when internet connectivity, not limited to mobile internet that everybody has, but actual high-speed broadband internet connectivity, when a village gets that particular connection, what really happens to it? And I decided to study the 3 pilot sites of the project. And these were the first to be connected to fiber optic cable in October 2012. These were Arai, Rajasthan, Parvada in Andhra Pradesh, and Panisagar in Tripura. And I began my fieldwork 4 years after these places were connected. And I visited all sites between May 2016 to August 2016. Now, because there were pilot sites, there were certain calculations that the project team took into consideration. So if you'd notice, Rajasthan is on the plains, very sandy. Parvada and Andhra Pradesh is on the coast. And Panisagar, Tripura is in the remote northeast. So they were chosen as pilot sites because it allowed for the exploration of different kinds of geographies and topographies. So the NOFN in practice, what happens is, firstly, fiber optic connectivity is given to the Gram Panchayat building. And then from there, something called as horizontal connectivity is extended to all government offices in the vicinity. Now, these offices would include, things like the primary healthcare center. Then they would include the police station. They would include the Patwari office. So all offices of governance and of importance to village governance in that particular community will be given horizontal connectivity, not through cable, but through something, this white box that you see, it's called the broadband wireless terminal. So they're called as BBWT devices. And these are given connectivity through long range Wi-Fi. Now, how is NOFN being used? Mainly used for government to citizen services. So your e-Mitra Kendra or the e-Subhidha Kendra, where people generally go to obtain their caste certificates or to update their ration cards. The internet is very well used for these purposes. In Andhra Pradesh, I saw slightly more nuanced and more sophisticated uses, where the staff at the Gram Panchayat buildings would also use it to video conference with each other. And my observation was just that the Andhra Pradesh government is much more, looks at technology and what they should be doing with it and how they implement it with a little more sophistication than the other sites that I was visiting. So the staff there are also very well equipped with tablets and smartphones, which they use to record all of the data from the village and feed it back to the block and the state level. In ATREE, Rajasthan, I also saw Pratham, which works in the field of education. So they were running a telecenter for the digital literacy of the school children in many villages that were allied to the ATREE block. And they would conduct separate classes for boys and girls. And as a consequence of this, most of the children in these villages had a very high familiarity with technology. So they could navigate the internet very well. For them, the main attraction obviously was wanting to get onto Facebook and wanting to explore the latest Haryanvi songs on YouTube, because the popular culture in these villages, while they recognize mainstream Hindi and Bollywood, they feel a sense of affinity towards pop culture that comes to them from Haryana, which is the neighboring state. So all of the children here are very well versed in how to get onto the internet and what to do with it. Though if you as an outsider go into these places, they would often request you for your mobile number because they need a mobile number to get onto Facebook, and the parents often refuse. Another use of the NOFN infrastructure was being made by commercial Wi-Fi service providers who were trying to pilot their services as trial runs, because when you have to pilot or when you have to install commercial Wi-Fi services, you need backhaul capability of fiber optic cables. And because the NOFN infrastructure was there in Rajasthan, it saw interest from a lot of private players. And in the village that I did my fieldwork, there were 2 commercial players who distributed free coupons of Wi-Fi to the community so that they could see how it was working and how to deploy it and what the pain points were. But the dominant picture of NOFN that I encountered in all of the 3 sites that I visited was not of things working, but actually of repairs, of breakdowns, and of things not working. So as you can see from the pictures here, due to lack of electricity, nothing works. And in the school, the internet stopped working. So all of the equipment that was given to them as part of NOFN was also laying in a state of disuse and disrepair. But there are also very interesting stories and things that can't be anticipated when the internet is really given to a village. So one of the very interesting things that speaks to the topic that I'm going to be speaking on is how the password for the Wi-Fi of the Gram Panchayat office simply leaks into the village, because you have a lot of people from the village itself who are working as staff in these offices, and they can't not share the password of this high-speed internet that has come to them with their friends, and their friends will in turn give it to other people. So when I went into RI, I noticed that the Wi-Fi password is very freely circulating. I was also offered it as, maybe this is going to be of use to you, because my mobile was also operating on very patchy 2G speeds. And they said, oh, it's okay. You can just take this password and use it anyway. Everybody knows about it in the village. So by default, all of the built structures in the village that had Wi-Fi access, their passwords were all known. And it had all turned into an accidental free Wi-Fi hotspot, really, which prompted me to ask the question, who gets to use the Wi-Fi, right? If there is free Wi-Fi available in the village at 3 different places, then who is really using this? And I asked this question both based on my observation. So as you can see here, most of the pictures feature men in the photographs because they were the only people that I was seeing who were using the Wi-Fi. So observation, yes, but also this was drawing, the question that I had about Wi-Fi was drawing on my own reflexivity. And this was my first time ever visiting Rajasthan. And I was on work here. Arai is very close to Ajmer. And I was experiencing a lot of marginalization of my own identity. And it reached a peak when all the hotels in the town that I had to live with so that I could commute to Arai to do field work denied me accommodation. So I was literally going from hotel to hotel with my luggage, hoping to get a room, but nobody was willing to offer me a room simply because I was a single woman and I was unaccompanied. So this was an incident that actually took me some time to put behind and get on with the field work, because while you know that these things happen and while you've heard of it, actually experiencing it for yourself and realizing your privilege as an urban educated person has absolutely no currency in these places, because for them, their dominant view of a woman and how they think they should treat a woman is going to be very stable and is not going to be accommodative of who you are and the kind of work that you want to do. In addition to that, when I actually enter the community, now observations are very important for the kind of ethnographic qualitative work that I do. And for observations, you really can't be indoors, you have to be outdoors. So I would try and occupy the public seating areas in the Gram Panchayat office, and many of the men would tell me that, you know, you're bringing bad name and you're bringing disrepute to yourself by hanging around in these public spaces. So a lot of my own experiences colored why I was asking who gets to use the public Wi-Fi, because even if an outsider like me is experiencing so much of marginalization and being told to go indoors and to not show herself out like this, I was wondering what is the experience of the women in this community when it comes to public infrastructures which would require them to be outdoors in some way or the other. So there are other reasons why space and Wi-Fi are very closely intertwined. So one is Wi-Fi infrastructures make space very salient, because if you have to access internet via Wi-Fi, you have to be within the range of the internet signal, which means that space is now bounded by the internet signals that this particular infrastructure is really putting out. So in some ways, the infrastructure begins defining the space by saying, this is salient, this is potent. So if you have to access and use Wi-Fi, you have to be within the range of this particular radius of this infrastructure. The other reason is, as Doreen Massey's wonderful work would point out, and she has this whole body of literature that talks about how spaces are susceptible to conflicts and differences. Like who can occupy a space is often a power struggle between various different communities. If there are no rules set in place, then it becomes a sort of a power struggle. And typically communities that are weak in some way would often lose up, because the dominant communities assert their right to be there. And by that very nature, other communities become excluded and they become more inhibited from venturing into that particular space. So one is, of course, Wi-Fi signals bounding the space and making it salient, but then there's also, even without those signals, spaces have their own character and have their own features which kind of lend it a particular flavor about who is there, what are they allowed to do, what are they not allowed to do, who is included, who is excluded. In India, when we talk about public spaces, it's very well recognized that access to public spaces in India is very unequal. We've had a lot of social media campaigns in the past years, such as Why Loiter, which issued this clarion call to women that come out and assert your right to be in parks, in spaces, and just loiter there. Because typically, if women have to go out and step outside their homes, they are supposed to have a purpose. You know, if you're just loitering around, it's not done. We generally never see this. It's always with a purpose. Either they are going out to purchase something, they're going out to work, they're going out to pick up their children. There is always a purpose attached to their presence that justifies why they should be outside the house. So the Why Loiter media campaign, which was, I think it started because of this book called Why Loiter, which the 3 professors from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Bombay wrote, describing in great detail and with very interesting data how women's right to public spaces is restricted and how this affects the kind of leisure activities that they indulge in. There was another campaign on the back of Why Loiter called Pinjra Tod, which was this campaign targeted at college students living in hostels. And on the back of this campaign, the girls of the BITS Pilani campus actually succeeded in getting the curfew on their hostel hours lifted. So this was again because the boys at BITS Pilani did not really have a curfew that dictated what time they should be back into the hostel, but the girls did. So this campaign was kind of successful in allowing them to not have a curfew hour anymore. So this unequal access to public spaces in India is also feminist literature that is grounded in the Indian context would often talk about how there is no infrastructure really supporting women who want to just be out, explore the city for purposes of leisure. So there will be no public toilets, streets will be very badly lit, which is why women prefer to be back home indoors, because who wants to walk down around a dark street for a few hours of fun and get into trouble later, right? So public infrastructure also does not really support a lot of these things. And if this is the case in cities, in big metros like Bombay, where Why Loiter really was written about, then what really happens to tier 2 towns and villages and rural communities, and what kind of challenges do women there really face? In addition to this, there is a huge policy push for Wi-Fi as a way of connecting rural India. And the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India in 2017 released a document specifying how Wi-Fi can be very helpful in onboarding the unconnected onto the internet. And their vision was to have Wi-Fi as a very ubiquitous mechanism for connectivity, both in the cities and in rural areas. And in fact, the document talks about how they want consumption of data to be as common as consuming a cup of hot chai. And Wi-Fi Dabba in Bangalore actually is trying to do this. So if you go to these small bakeries, you would often find Wi-Fi Dabba, and they retail internet through sachets, right? So it would be like 10 MB for say 20 rupees or 30 rupees. But again, the question is the kind of locations that things like Wi-Fi Dabba are deployed. What is the character of these spaces really? Who really goes to these bakeries? Who can really hang out at these bakeries? And Wi-Fi Dabba would say that they're trying to target the rickshaw-men, the auto rickshaw drivers, because typically they are the ones who'd probably stop and get out for a smoke in between rides, and can we then provide the internet to them, which is all fantastic. But if that is the way you look at it, then you are also excluding women from use, because bakeries are typically not places that women are going to just go out and hang around, right? So that automatically is excluding a whole population from easy access to the internet and hence using the internet. The TRAI's policy push for Wi-Fi is also coming because laying fiber optic infrastructure is time and capital intensive. Now, these pictures may not be making any sense to you. They don't make to me to a very large extent because I'm not an engineer, but it's just very capital and resource intensive, and also time. Because to lay fiber optic cables, you typically have to do a lot of digging, and this takes time, it's not easy, and also obviously costs you a lot of money. But Wi-Fi typically does not have these restrictions. So you could use your devices and specify whatever radius you want, and you would be connected. So the government of India feels that Wi-Fi is a much easier and a much quicker way to get the internet to the people. And to a large extent, it's true, but we also need to ask and interrogate how inclusive is this internet that you're taking to the people. So to give you an overview of Wi-Fi in Araing, the community where I did fieldwork. So these were the 3 accidental free Wi-Fi hotspots in the village that I already spoke about. In addition to this, there were 2 year-long Wi-Fi pilots that provided free coupons for the villagers to use the internet. Now, both these pilots got over a month before I went to the village for field work, but so I could not really observe the actual use of this pilot Wi-Fi, but they were frequently referenced by all of my mail interviews that I did for this study. So methods, I had two phases of field visits, 2017 and in 2018. These were generally observations. Intercepts and intercepts I mainly did with the male participants, which means that I would speak to them while they were using the internet in these locations. So these were very spontaneous and not really very mediated. But with the women, it was a different case. So with women, the interviews typically had to be pre-planned and we would only be meeting indoors, which was also challenging for me to recruit women into the study because the only people I could see around me were men. And I would take long walks into the village trying to find somebody to speak to. But typically the kind of women that I would find outdoors would generally be very senior, and they would be, cleaning the cattle sheds that were adjoining the families, and they were not users of smartphones, they were not users of the internet. And I was really looking for young people, young girls to speak to. And this is also testimony to the serendipity that we as researchers encounter when we are doing field work. So one day I met this girl who was dressed in a way that was very atypical for the community that I was in, because she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and she was accompanied by a wheeled lady who was her relative. So I just walked up to her and asked her, I introduced myself and I told her that I just want to know, do you own a smartphone? Do you use the internet? And she said, yes, I do. And she actually invited me home and she said, my elder sister is actually a more enthusiastic user of the internet and you should come speak to her. And that was my entry really into the home. And these two were my first recruits for my particular study. And they helped me snowball many other women of their acquaintance. So through snowballing, I could gather 6 women who were willing to speak to me, and 14 men, because getting men was really not an issue. So the women were between 22 to 29 years of age. Out of the women, only one was married with a kid. Rest, everybody were unmarried. And the men were between 16 to 22 years of age. And I also interviewed one of the Wi-Fi service providers who was piloting his service in the village. I also had a lot of school children who were using the internet very freely at these Wi-Fi spots. But again, these school children were only school boys. So the girls who were going to school would never really come out to use the internet at the free Wi-Fi hotspots. So I would have informal interactions with them, but I'm not reporting their data because I did not have IRB approval, ethics board approval for speaking to minors. All of the women that I spoke to were graduates. They were salaried, which means that they had their own independent sense of income. They owned smartphones and they spent money on mobile internet data. And the men ranged from students to salaried workers to unemployed. Some were college dropouts. Not all of them owned their own smartphones. Many of them would borrow it. Not all of them were using mobile internet. So the free Wi-Fi in the community was really their only source of internet access and use. So I'll segue into my findings. So something that I want to talk about is how invisible women as internet users really are. So as one of my participants said, women use the internet. It is just that our use will not be visible to outsiders and casual visitors because we're indoors at home. Our use is only through mobile internet and not on the Wi-Fi access points in the village that are all outdoors, right? So because this was also the question that struck me, why is it that only men are using? Is it that women simply don't know how to use the internet, or is it that they're not able to use the internet for various reasons? So it's just that they're not very visible as users in the same way that men are. Another thing that the women participants told me is the constant sense of surveillance that they feel the moment they step outside their homes. So in our village, where girls go and what they do is not something that only concerns a girl or a family. It is almost as if the entire village participates in determining our movements. The males don't experience these constraints. To access the free Wi-Fi from the office, I would either have to go to the office or the open grounds behind it. It is considered disreputable for women to be seen around these places. And I will have to deal with a lot of people talking and asking me about my presence there. Who wants to deal with that, right? So this constant sense of surveillance that women experience was also represented in my data in two ways. So when I would ask about privacy, for instance, the boys in the village would tell me, we don't really care about privacy, all of us know each other here. But if I pose the same privacy question to women, they would not talk in terms of everyone knowing each other. They would talk in terms of everyone monitoring us. So there is a sense of switch, even in language, when you're speaking to women and when you're speaking to men, about things like who can really move in the village and what kind of privacy do they really experience as individuals and as people. A lot of my women participants mentioned seeking and finding out third spaces for accessing the internet. So the government has set up centers such as Atal Seva Kendra in all villages, which are supposed to provide internet access for citizens for their own use. So I even asked a lot of women that, okay, there is, you cannot use the Wi-Fi because this is outdoor, but there are Atal Seva Kendras in the community, so don't you want to go there to use the internet? And the women told me that although there are plenty of these Atal Seva Kendras, not only in their village, but also in surrounding villages, they don't really like visiting them because the men stare. And not only do the men stare, but they also, say things like, the second quote, for instance, when the Atal Seva Kendra was first opened, it offered free internet service to the village. I went there once to try it out, and a man there was very rude to me. He passed snide remarks saying, look, they have all come here for internet only because it does not cost them. So they've all come here because it's free. And the first quote which says that although there are plenty of e-Mitra centers here, I don't like visiting them because again, the men stare. I feel more comfortable in Kishangarh since it's a bigger town and nobody knows me there. So all of these women, many of whom were, college going, said that they go to Kishangarh for the pursuit of leisure activities. So if they have to meet friends in RI in their own community, the only option that they would have is to meet each other in their homes. And because there was simply no other places where they could step out for leisure. But in Kishangarh, there was a space, there were restaurants, there were hotels where they could come together, spend time with their friends, indulge in the outdoors the way young people want to. But they sought geographical distance from their own community simply because there were spaces specifically cultivated for leisure purposes in these distant, bigger towns. And there, obviously, they didn't experience the same sense of surveillance and monitoring of their activities that they would experience in their own communities. The men did not really mention having to go to Kishangarh only to escape the very oppressive feelings that they would have in the village. They sought Kishangarh simply because it was a bigger place and it offered many more avenues for leisure. Speaking to women also reveals that they had this very acute sense of space-time interactions. So they would be very nuanced in their answers and give me very distinct differences between how visiting a space is very different from lingering in a space. And this is very important for internet access when you want to do it over Wi-Fi, because you have to be in a certain radius and you have to stay in that particular radius for however long you want to, if you want to be on the internet. So as one participant pointed out, I am able to visit the post office, but I will not be able to linger there because you're expected to finish your work and leave. However, I can linger at the temple without being worried about what people would say, even though men are present there. I can also linger at the bus stop because that is what the space is meant for. However, neither the temple nor the bus stop has Wi-Fi coverage, right? So this distinction of visiting a space versus lingering there was not something that any of the male participants really even thought of or even mentioned. But for women, they, because of their experiences and because of the surveillance that they experienced from their larger community, they were very aware of what they could do that would be considered suitable in all of these public spaces that were occupied. Because this is also important to mention, because generally when any kind of services have to be set up, people tend to say that, the post office is something that's open to everybody. People would come there, so let's set this up there. Or the Gram Panchayat office is again assumed to be very public, open to everybody in the community, so let's set it up there. But when you speak to women, they are obviously going to disagree that these are not really public spaces because they are not comfortable for us to really step into and occupy. But if you look at the bus stop, everybody is lingering there, so that's going to be okay. If you look at the temple in our community, that's still okay because there's a certain sanctity associated with a place of religion. So when you ask them that, okay, fine, the Gram Panchayat does not seem to be a very comfortable place for you to access Wi-Fi. These were two of the options that they gave me, along with the girls' school in the community, as spaces where they could perhaps go and access public Wi-Fi if it was installed there. Another very interesting finding that emerged was how women experience Wi-Fi. And my participants told me that they experience Wi-Fi not through use, but only by seeing others use or by hearing about Wi-Fi. So as the first participant told me, when the boys come to my shop, she was running a grocery store in the village. So when the boys come to my shop, I often hear them talking about Wi-Fi and making plans to spend time there. That is how I found out about Wi-Fi in the village. Another participant told me I would often see these schoolboys clustered around the block office. I once asked them what they all did there every day, and that is when they told me about the free password for the Wi-Fi. So while the men in the community had actually experienced the use of Wi-Fi and how different it would be from mobile internet, the women in the community had only heard about this Wi-Fi and they would see the boys using it, but they had never been able to use it themselves. Now, because of this, men and women also reported very different uses of the internet. So this difference came about because the men that I was speaking to at these Wi-Fi hotspots reported a much more diverse range of use, right? So they would be using Facebook, they would be using WhatsApp, they would be using the Wi-Fi there to download films, to download songs, to play games. But when I was speaking to the women, they reported very limited uses. They would say that, yes, I'm on WhatsApp because it's become like a status symbol, so I have to be connected. But otherwise, I'm only using my mobile internet to perhaps, fill up any competitive exam forms that may be there, or to apply for government jobs. And I immediately shut it down because that itself consumes a lot. And I have to be very careful about how much data I'm consuming and ration it according to my needs. So, and it's not that the women did not want to access the internet for leisure purposes. They also wanted to get onto YouTube. They also wanted to send pictures to their friends. They also wanted to upload their photos onto Facebook. But they weren't doing that because they had to be very conscious, A, about the fact that this is going to cost them money. And secondly, also because the internet speeds were not very supportive of these things that typically require better speeds to be able to accomplish these tasks quickly. So like this participant said, it has become a status symbol to be on WhatsApp and Facebook. So I save my data to communicate with my friends and family on these platforms. I would really like to download films and songs, but that is not possible with the slow speeds on my data pack. I also use the internet to browse job opportunities. So even though I want to access entertainment content, I cannot. The Wi-Fi hotspot itself emerged as a place for peer learning for men. So all of the male participants that I spoke to told me how they learned a lot about the internet, a lot about the smartphones, a lot about different apps that were available simply by visiting this hotspot, because many other friends of theirs would also come there and they would learn from each other. So like this participant said, I learned about the availability of free internet here along with the password because I would see boys hanging around here. In fact, my Facebook account too was created by one of the boys here because I did not know how to do that. When we come here for internet, we also discuss and share various things. And I think I am reasonably well informed about the internet now. So men spend more time using the internet and were also able to access it at different times of the day and night. And they could also strategize the use of space to maximize internet use. So as you can see in this photo, to get better internet signals, they would be doing a lot of things, like they would climb buildings, they would climb onto trees. And they would also be able to come here at different times in the day. Now, this was very important because the first phase of my fieldwork here happened in July, which was the peak of the summer, and Rajasthan summers are to be experienced to really understand how intense the heat can get. So during the daytime, really, I would not find too many men coming to this place because they would typically come very early in the morning, or they would come, even at night time and spend a lot of time there because it was more cooler at that point in time. But women could not really strategize and maximize their use of, time and space to be able to access it. Now, just as men said that, they learned about technology and they learned about internet from their peers, the women, in contrast, reported depending on the male relatives. So there was actually no woman who told me that I learned about the internet or I learned something new about my smartphone or about how to use the internet from another woman. They typically would say that they learn things about the internet from the male relatives, especially their brothers. So if a woman had brothers, she would say that, I learn about this because he tells me newer things. So like this woman said, my brother juggles his mobile internet use between 4 SIM cards. He has one from every service provider. So he suggested that I get 2 for myself. That way I can alternate between the 2 SIM cards and get good deals for myself to stretch my budget for data. But it's very rare that women would tell me that, they learned hacks like this, or they learned ways of how to maximize their use from other women. It used to always come from their immediate male relatives, either their cousins or their brothers. The fathers would typically never figure in these conversations. So it was generally their cousins and their brothers whom they were close to, because all of these communities had very large joint families and they would live in very close quarters. When I asked people about the 2 Wi-Fi pilots that were distributing free coupons in the community for use, I found out that men were the only beneficiaries of the coupons. So most men in the village knew about the free Wi-Fi pilots, even if they were not using it. But in contrast, the women that I spoke to had only heard about the free Wi-Fi pilots if they had, their brothers who had received their coupons. So I spoke to the service providers to find out if they had even made any attempt to think about gender when they were distributing the coupons. And they said, no, not really. And the reason that they gave me was to access Wi-Fi, you need a smartphone, not your gender, right? And when I pointed out to them that there were a lot of gender disparities that my study was revealing, they said, fine, if you have data, then we'll think about it. But this is not something that had really entered the calculations when they were trying to determine where they should really set up the Wi-Fi infrastructure. So I asked them, what kind of things do you really take into account when you decide where do you set up the infrastructure? So they said, well, there has to be 360-degree population around the infrastructure so that people can use it. And it has to be in a place that is accessible by the public. And I asked them, what kind of places would this be? And they said post office, and they said Gram Panchayat office, which is why I asked women questions about, what would you think about having this at the post office or the Gram Panchayat? So even when they were piloting their services, they said we just distributed it to, one person, and through word of mouth, it really spread. So gender really does not enter their calculations at all. The assumption behind a statement like this is that, if women have a smartphone, then they are going to come and access the Wi-Fi. The reason why they're not accessing the Wi-Fi is because they probably don't have the smartphone, or they perhaps are digitally illiterate, which, like my study shows, is not really the case. So these assumptions really need to be interrogated and questioned because they influence how a particular system or a particular infrastructure is being designed for use and who ultimately then gets to use it. So some of my conclusions, we need to critically examine infrastructure. And Wi-Fi is a very interesting case because it is inherently assumed to be very utopian and democratic, that privileges freedom, mobility, and sociality. How is this? Because the Wi-Fi infrastructure is not very visible, right? You don't really see electric lines, you don't really see pipes the way we see which are carrying water. It's just a small router, and we sometimes don't even know where that is placed. We are just looking for the indication of Wi-Fi when our smartphones alert us that Wi-Fi signals are available. So because there is no visible, tangible presence of the infrastructure, it is assumed to be something that's very utopian, that is very secretive, that is something that is very easily deployed, accessible to everyone, and something that privileges a lot of freedom, a lot of mobility, and a lot of sociality, because people tend to converge around social spots, around Wi-Fi hotspots. And we have a very good example of Starbucks and how a lot of people walk into it, not just because of the coffee, but because of Wi-Fi, and how that turns into a social hotspot. But is that really so, right? And whose freedom, mobility, and sociality is an infrastructure like this really privileging if you don't sit down to think whom you're really allowing access and use of the infrastructure? So who is the infrastructure addressing? Who is it leaving out? So as Brian Larkin would point out, that infrastructure also exists as forms that are separate from their technical functioning. So you need to analyze infrastructures as concrete semiotic and aesthetic vehicles that are oriented towards addressees. Typically, we tend to think of infrastructures only as something that is composed of very technical elements. But what if you begin thinking of them from a semiotic point of view? Or what if you start thinking of them from an aesthetic point of view? So the moment you talk semiotics, you're also questioning whom is this particular system or whom is this particular message being addressed to? And if you're addressing it to someone, then whom are you excluding, right? So Larkin's anthropological work on infrastructure is a very helpful departure point to begin thinking about who is being included and who is really being excluded from systems like this. Another point of view is from human-computer interaction, or HCI as we call it, and what Barzel and Barzel tell us about designing for subjectivities. Now, they ask, how do you understand the user? Now, in human-computer interaction, because it's all about designing products and systems, the notion of user is very dominant, right? So HCI asks, how do you really think of the user? And they make two very potent distinctions between designing for subject positions and designing for subjectivities of information. So they point out that typically we conceive of users as subjects of systems and associated social practices, right? And whatever design sensibility we bring to the project is only to support and extend the particular activities that this user wants to. But what if you start thinking about subjectivities? And the moment you start thinking about subjectivities, you start talking about the lived experience of individuals, and you start talking about the agency of individuals, right? And what do they really do? How do they really experience this particular system that you've created? And they point out that we not only design systems and not only design products, but our decisions also design users, right? So who is this user that we are really defining for is something that we have to keep in mind. And they say that, us approaching the design of systems or approaching the design of products from this particular design sensibility means that the role of design changes from merely supporting and extending human agency to actually cultivating and transforming human agency, such that it can be occupied by a much more diverse range of people than the user as a subject that you have very narrowly designed. So when you talk about designing for subjectivities, how can you design more inclusive Wi-Fi hotspots? So recognition of felt subjectivities of women as internet users in rural India would then include users who are active but invisible as subjects of this Wi-Fi infrastructure. We can define the women as users who can afford and who are willing to pay for Wi-Fi services, and then service providers can become more attentive to their needs. Because all of the women participants that I spoke to said that they would even be willing to pay because internet is very crucial for them, and it's something that they need as much as men. So if this Wi-Fi service provider wants to charge me to provide Wi-Fi, I'm willing to pay as long as it's in a space that I am able to access and use, because like I said, they were anyway paying for the use of mobile internet. And they said we would be very happy to pay if we are going to be getting high speed and more reliable internet connectivity. We can also look at women as users who can and want to use the internet in the same way that men do, but experience constraints in what they use the internet for. So again, this distinction about men being able to use the internet for entertainment, but women restricting their use to very instrumental purposes. We also need to look at women as users who experience constant surveillance from the communities that they live in, which means where they go, where they spend time outside the domain of their families is something that everybody is going to be very attentive to and even talk about and gossip. And lastly, we need to look at women as users who do not share the same relationship with spaces that are deemed to be public in the way that men do. So closely related to this, what can service providers do? So what recommendation would I have from my study to service providers who are going to be playing a very important role in executing the Government of India's policy decision to set up Wi-Fi hotspots in rural areas? One is to build more diverse teams. So technology as a domain is sometimes very staffed a lot by male. And the picture that I showed you of the service providers that I spoke to were also 3 men, right? If service providers have more women in the team, it's more likely that they will be able to access these women who are otherwise invisible. I could not have been able to do this study if I were a man, right? Because no family would have allowed a male researcher to really speak to their daughters. Similarly, as service providers, if they have women in their teams, maybe these women engineers or designers or usability or user experience researchers will have easier access to women and thus be able to incorporate their experiences into the way they design products. If that is not possible, what service providers could do is interview the men about the habits about the internet habits of the women in their family. Because as we see, the women depend a lot on the male relatives to be able to help them navigate the internet. So while they are invisible as users to outsiders of the community, the men in the community very well know how digitally literate their women relatives are. So if accessing women is difficult, then the next best thing that service providers could perhaps do is interview the men to ask, who are there women in their house who are using technology? What are the users? What kind of constraints do they face? Lastly, what can governments do? So government and regulators such as the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India could mandate regulations of social inclusivity along with the technological conditions that they currently frame. So if you pick up the TRAI document on Wi-Fi access and use, you'll find a lot of it talks about the technical architecture of what these Wi-Fi deployments should look like. So they will talk about a lot about, how should seamless connectivity be provided to users as they move from one Wi-Fi point to another, and what technical specifications can make this possible. But there is no mention in their document about social inclusivity. The moment a government regulator like TRAI begins talking about these things, service providers have no option but to fall in line. So the government also needs to become sensitive to the fact that just deploying an infrastructure in a community does not mean that everybody is going to be able to use them. Unless you make or you mandate certain rules that service providers have to follow and ask them to be more sensitive about which spaces in the community and which areas they could really be deploying this infrastructure from, service providers are going to keep ignoring issues like this. So this is something that governments can also do at their level to make internet access and use much more inclusive than it currently is. So I'm going to end my talk here and open it up for questions that you may have, if any. Thank you. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So this is more like questions to have you heard this Africa project Lifelines?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering if both of you just the counter.
Yes.
Both of you
Definitely.
something interesting about
Yes.
because a lot of papers like academia is
Yes, I agree. That is a problem. No, definitely. And I'd be open to see how we could perhaps democratize Wi-Fi use even in the public, and recognizing the fact that a lot of academic knowledge gets bound up in just journal and conference proceedings and, the ivory tower thinking that pervades. I, on my part, have made efforts. I have written op-eds talking about this particular issue. I have reached out to service providers, hoping that they'd give me a hearing, but it's not always successful. They sometimes don't like to listen about these things because it makes their job harder. They just want to deploy and move, right? And they feel that if rickshaw drivers are using, then everyone is using. So I think the process of pushing back against this can often be challenging in many ways. So partnering with social movements like Blank Noise is of course a good idea, and I but we need to find out the logistics and what we should really be doing. Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. If you can speak a little louder. Yes.
Okay, so I just was wondering about your data, like 6 women, 14 men. Was it all from location or different?
No, they were all from the same community. This fieldwork was done in Arai in Rajasthan. It's around 45 kilometers from Ajmer.
Okay. What was the social component?
Social composition in what sense? What would you like to? These were generally what you would consider middle class. I've often been asked about my small sample size and why my sample is not more diverse. So there are two reasons for it. One is because I was denied accommodation in the village. I was myself commuting 90 kilometers every day to and fro the village. So the time that I was spending in the community was very limited. So as I pointed out, also because it was summer and peak temperatures, many of the men would either come early in the morning or late into the night. So my sample of men was also limited, but the sample of women was also more challenging because I was depending on the goodwill of the first few participants that I spoke to be able to snowball. But as this is a qualitative study, we are more interested also in understanding the machinery of interaction rather than generalizing. And I don't think the logic and the argument that this study makes is going to change if I had more people in the sample in that case. I think it would still hold true. But because we're talking about inclusivity, you bring a very good point about caste and social compositions, because here I'm addressing only gender inclusivity. But we also, of course, have to be sensitive towards the disabled, towards different caste compositions. Amongst the men, I found a larger, the village that I was in was primarily composed of Jats, and they were all farmers. So they had their own compulsions of having to work in the field and thus not being able to come visit. So I had more of, students even amongst the males in my sample. I don't know if that answers your question in any way, but the caste composition was predominantly Jat. Hi. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. 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 Hmm. Women get there. Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Of course, I don't deny it at all, but it's just that my access to these people were very limited. And I don't think my research is contradicting what your colleague would have said, because if you notice, the quote said that even though men are there, we can still linger. So they are totally not denying the fact that, the temple area is not occupied by men. It's just that they will face lesser social censure simply because it is a place of religion and, you go there during your evening walk or... Yes. In fact, another feedback that I received is that, what if Wi-Fi is deployed in the spaces that right now are accessible to women, like bus stops or temples, because then more and more men will start coming and that will change again the accessibility of that particular case. But again, that's a hypothetical situation. We won't know unless that affordance is firstly given. Once it comes into place, maybe we can then see what really happens and what more we could do. But right now, the women, because they're invisible, they are not being recognized as users in the first place. So I think baby steps to be able to get to answer your question there. Thank you. Hi.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I'm just like, especially this, you're looking at That is also around some infrastructure which is not considered. Because we have feminist approach. So my question is, have you come across some things in their growth, thinking of, consciously thinking of coming out and
No, no,
nobody,
no.
because that is restricted.
Yes, and like I mentioned, as an outsider, I could afford to ignore a lot of things that were said about me, because I was anyway a temporary visitor in the community, and I would, exit the community and go out. But these people have to live there and in very close proximity with their neighbors. In rural community, you can't really ignore the people that you live with, because you're, in many instances, the kinship ties are also, they are composed of weddings, that intermarriages that happen. So it's very difficult to say, no, you mind your own business and don't tell me what I should be doing or how I should be living my life. It's simply not something that would cross their mind, though they would obviously, desire freedom from these restrictions. It's not very easy for them to break. It's not very easy for men also in different contexts, right? So it's not just a women problem. It's just that these are very small, close-knit communities. So.
So I was thinking, even if the women get the access to Wi-Fi and all, in most of the rural sector, they are so busy with the
Yes.
work,
Yes.
daily life,
Yes.
whether they will be able to take use of the
Yes.
Wi-Fi.
Yes, I think that is a fair thing to say, because even with women who don't experience these restrictions, typically I did some work around Wi-Fi at railway stations. A lot of women would tell me, speaking about their internet use at their homes, they would say, it is something that we can only do once we are done with housework and once we are done with childcare. But I don't think we can, take that as the condition and say that anyway you're going to be busy with housework, so why should we care about making the space more inclusive?
I'm saying they are not getting more free time as compared to men.
Well, that may be true, but then whatever free time that they get, are you allowing them, or are they free to use high-speed internet at that point in time? So something that people working on building Wi-Fi infrastructures tell me is that eventually the technology is not going to be limited only to one particular area that is going to get. The way they are thinking about advancing technology is to interconnect neighborhoods through Wi-Fi networks, which would then mean that women don't really need to step out and come into the open or come to a particular spot to be able to use Wi-Fi. They can probably do it from the comfort of their homes. But the rural communities that I have been interacting with still don't have that. There will just be one particular spot in the community where they probably have to go and use Wi-Fi. So.
Thanks, Preeti. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
While your talk and the work kind of broadly touches upon how spaces are gendered, technology is also gendered. The larger issue about the genderedness of technology, space, and everything else has to be addressed not by changing technology, but by changing the social fabric and the way people think. That's an inherent problem. I don't think whether the technology or any of those interventions can really bring about change.
And my response to that would be that there has to be some catalyst for this. Who's going to demonstrate this or take the first step in wanting to change this particular social fabric? Now, because technology is held in high esteem by people in rural communities, if service providers begin talking this language, if somebody begins talking this language, it's easier for people to become sensitized and to agree. So my male participants were all very sympathetic with what was happening to the women. And if I speak to older males, I don't find that sympathy. So if I speak to fathers, they would tell me that internet is very undesirable and our daughters need to be kept away from it. But if I speak to younger boys, they are very sympathetic about how restrictive this can be and how their sisters or their cousins cannot really come and freely access Wi-Fi and enjoy downloading films and enjoy downloading songs the way they do. So there is obviously a certain sense of, catch them young and speak to them about inclusiveness and gender diversity, because younger people are much more receptive to these messages, whereas older people would simply push back against it and say, why do you even want to bring internet to our daughters? It's not something that we think is desirable for them. And this is very reflective in how Khap Panchayat sometimes announce bans, and they say, women should not own mobile phones at all. And there have been lots of incidents in Bihar and in Haryana where communities have come together, panchayats have come together and said that we are definitely not going to be allowing the women in this community access and use of mobile phones because they have affairs and then they elope. And that obviously shakes the caste and class foundations of communities, which is completely undesirable. So similar to the case of the Andhra Pradesh village passing a diktat against women not being allowed to wear nighties. So I think the definition of technology and what is allowed to women and not needn't necessarily be things that we traditionally recognize as technology. It can even be something as simple as an IT. So I think definitely bringing about a larger change in the social fabric is very important, but then these changes are also very slow and very incremental. It's not going to happen overnight.
I mean, but you can see those changes happening in, say, various sectors. Like, for example, Anu's work on sanitation sector, slowly there's recognition that there is an element of genderedness in.
That's very heartening to know. That's very heartening to know. I'm not very familiar with work being done in the sanitation area, but that's very encouraging to know that this is what your study is revealing. Thank you so much. Yes, Rashmi.
So, I was just curious about something. So you interviewed very young women between 20 and 21.
Yes.
So did you? So when you are interviewing these women in their houses, there must be their mothers or grandmothers around. So did any of them show any interest in using internet, but not able to do because they were not, they are not literate. Did you learn about?
No, the mothers typically didn't show any interest in wanting to use, but they were supportive of their daughters using it, which was a very different story from the fathers. So the mothers would often, collaborate and collude to kind of protect their daughters. The first participant I spoke to had kept her purchase of the mobile phone a secret from her father for around a week, and her mother helped her do that. So I found the mothers quite supportive and recognizing, what the internet could do, because they saw the daughters through the day and they knew that they needed it to prepare for their exams or to apply for competitive exams and to apply for government jobs. So they kind of recognized the importance of it. But the fathers could only look at it from the point of view of this is mischief and, our girls might go astray if they get online. So that dichotomy was there. Okay, thank you so much for having me here.